Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late.
More.
I I just I'm just late. I have plenty of excuses. I just not any good ones. I got up a little late. I went worked out. Thought I had time to work out. I really didn't. So I just rushed over here from the rec center to the YMCA right here on campus, and I'm sweating. I stink. Thank goodness you can't smell me. I'm just I'm sure I don't look too good either. Well, I probably never did, but even worse today. All right, all right. We're here. That's the main thing. Okay, GDP's due tonight. That's chapter 23. CPI due Thursday. That's chapter 24. We're going to start chapter 25 today.
Hello, Professor?
Anything on your mind? Any questions before we start?
I can't hear you.
Say that again. Someone said something. I just turned up my speaker. Can you hear me? You'd let me know if you couldn't hear me, right?
I can hear you now.
Just not let me go on and on and on. Yeah, that would be pretty funny. Yeah. Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is introduce you to the rest of the course. We are now beginning macroeconomics in all seriousness. Now, I think I'm going to start saying stuff I say in this little presentation, but yeah, we're beginning the course now. So here we go. Let's start the course that y'all signed up for. Oh, let's see. I forgot how to do this.
Hey, Mr. Ford.
Yeah, shoot.
Chapter 23 is due tonight, right?
Yeah.
11:59.
Pardon?
At 11:59, right?
Yeah.
All right, sweet.
11:59. And 24 CPI. That was a short one. That's due Thursday. Yes, indeed. And now we're starting 25 productivity, except for I'm talking when I can't think and talk at the same time. Hold on. Let me make sure I've got this thing. Now okay, you see let's see, what do you see? Okay. Okay, I'm playing something called Intro to the Rest of the Course. Tell me if you can't hear it.
Up to now, we've covered a lot of different things. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, an introduction here, an introduction there, to economics and basic principles, supply and demand, and a little bit about the GDP and consumer price index. Now we're actually starting the course. Now we're actually studying macroeconomics. Now, everything we've done so far, we've needed to know, but now we're actually studying the macroeconomy. So I'm going to start out with a little introduction to the business cycle. Okay, if we plot GDP over time, it goes something like this. Okay, up and down. So as we go through time, GDP tends to rise and it falls, and it rises and it falls. That is called the business cycle. It's usually called the business cycle. It's called economic fluctuations, that kind of thing. So let's take a look at the parts of the business cycle. This here, where GDP is going up, is called an expansion. Now, if the expansion is really, really fast, we'll call it a boom, an economic boom. That's when GDP is ripping and roaring. This right here at the peak is called the peak. Now, here where it's going down, that's called a recession. Falling GDP. Now, the official definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth or falling GDP. And if the recession is really going down, we call that a depression. Okay, so a depression is a very serious recession. I can't remember who said it, but something like a recession is when your neighbor's out of a job, and a depression is when you're out of a job. Well, that's probably pretty accurate, but the official economic definition is falling GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. Okay, and here where it bottoms out, well, I don't know why they don't just call it the bottom. They call this the peak over here, but this is called the trough. And then it repeats again. It's a peak. So we go through one of these cycles on average, roughly every 7 years. Doesn't matter who's in office. I know, even if your favorite politician's in office, that it might happen when they're in charge. So we'll talk more about that later, get a little ahead. But let's just say government's ability to manage the economy has proved to be somewhat disappointing. It's pretty tough. Okay, very mixed results. Okay, well, if you'll notice, it's we're going up and down, up and down. There's a trend. Call this the trend line. The trend is up. Up and down, but the trend line is up. So this trend line is potential GDP, or sometimes called the trend line, or long run potential GDP, or sustainable GDP growth, that kind of thing. They're talking about the upward trend. And historically, that's been about 3%. Okay, rough ballpark 3%. If GDP gets higher than 3%, GDP growth higher than 3%, then we're kind of in a boom. We'd say we're in an.
Let me add here, I forgot to mention this, but whenever we talk about GDP, if not, unless otherwise specifically stated, we're talking real GDP, okay? Nominal GDP, again, when we covered that, that is, for the most part, a number that doesn't mean a whole lot by itself. We were interested in real GDP, which measures the actual output of goods and services. That's what we're talking about here.
An economic boom. And if it gets too higher than 3%, GDP growth higher than 3%, then we're kind of in a boom. We'd say we're in an economic boom. And if it gets too much higher than 3%, we kind of worry about inflation. The economy can overheat. And if it's less than that, sometimes we call that a growth recession. If it's puddling along at, say, 1% growth, that's definitely, it's growing, but it's underperforming. Okay, we've got room for improvement. Now, let's the next few chapters, the next few chapters, we're going to be talking about this long run trend here. We're just going to be looking at things, how things fit together over the long term. We're going to look at productivity. We're going to look at financial markets, the financial system, which enables productivity because capital is very expensive, has to be financed somehow, and that's the role of the financial system. And then we're going to get into the monetary system and inflation and unemployment, and so that's going to be all just kind of how things work. And then towards the end of the class, end of the semester, we're going to look at these fluctuations. Oh, those get real interesting because they're very politically charged. In a world of what have you done for me lately, these fluctuations are very highly politicized. Even though this long-run trend really to economists is the most important thing because those are driven by things like productivity, the subject of this chapter. It's these fluctuations that really get the votes. Now, if you happen to be in office while we're in one of these, pretty hard to not get reelected or elected. Well, if you're in office, you're reelected. If you're in office when one of these is taking place, then the chances are you're not going to get reelected. Someone's going to come in and replace you. Okay. But the fact is, these are going to happen no matter what. Okay, politicians, it's fair game. Politicians like to take credit for everything in the universe that's going well. They did it. Well, whether they did it or not, okay, I guess in that kind of world, it's only fair that they get the blame for everything that happens in the universe, whether they did it or not. Well, whether they really did or not. Okay, so I mean that's the game they're playing. But you know what? I guess the odds are in your favor since we only have one of these recessions every 7 years or so. So if you've got like 6 or 7 years of expansion to one of a recession, well, okay, I'll take those odds too if I were a politician. Well, whatever. Okay, this course isn't about politics, though I guess we're going to have to get into politics a little bit when we talk about this business cycle. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that take place during during this business cycle. Let's just take a look here. Okay, now GDP is going up during an expansion. Well, that's the definition of an expansion, so that's a little bit redundant. So we've got rising GDP, that's an economic expansion. So when GDP is rising, that means production's up, that means, goods and services are up. There's more of them, more being produced. Unemployment tends to go down. Why is that? Because if there's more output requires more inputs. Labor services are an input. So more labor will be demanded and unemployment will go down. Well, what else? Inflation tends to go up a little. Okay, well, I shouldn't say a little. It can go up. Okay, it depends on what else is going on. And as we'll see when we talk about inflation, usually that's a function, in the long term, that's a function of the money supply. Okay, but here during these business cycles, short term, prices can rise because, again, during increasing rates of output, demand for inputs rise, demand for labor increases, demand for other inputs increase. Okay, demand for raw materials. You know, and as the firms are competing for these inputs, it drives up their price. So you may see wages going up. You may see prices of, you know, lumber or that kind of thing going up. And, well, stock prices tend to rise. Why is that? Because if there's an expansion, there's more output, more going on, more activity, higher profits. And stock is ownership in a firm. When you own stock, you own the firm. So if you own 10 shares of a company and they've got 100 shares outstanding, you own 10% of that company. And so, yes, the higher the profits, the more valuable that company is, and therefore people will pay more to own it. The price of ownership is the stock price. And the dollar. The dollar tends to rise. Well, the dollar, if our economy is going well, GDP's up and stock prices are up, you know, that makes the U.S. economy a desirable place to invest in for foreigners, right? People overseas, they're going to look at our economy, hey, let's invest in the U.S. What do they need? They need dollars to do that. They're going to have to convert their currency into dollars, and then with those dollars make the investment. So demand for dollars increases, increasing the price of dollars relative to other currencies. Now, during a recession, well, everything's just the opposite, okay? GDP is going down. That's the definition of a recession. Unemployment is going up, because if output is going down, you don't need as many inputs, and one of those inputs is labor services, and so you're going to start laying off workers. Inflation, well, that'll ease prices. If there's less output and less demand for inputs, that's going to take pressure up of prices, and you might not have you might have inflation falling, or you might actually have falling prices, which is called deflation. Stocks, well, stock prices are going to go down. Less output, less profit. You know, the value of the ownership in the company is not worth as much now because profits aren't as high, and people will pay less for those shares of stock. Some people, you know, that will sell their stock, and the price will go down, and the dollar tends to go down because now the U.S. is not as desirable to invest in, and demand for those dollars to invest will subside. Now, it's not exactly like, okay, everybody, 1, 2, 3, GDP up, unemployment down, inflation up. You know, actually, unemployment, that may take place very late in an expansion, because if we're coming out of a recession, businesses want to make darn sure that this really is a sustainable expansion. I mean, they want to make sure this really is happening before they run back, because labor is the most expensive input of any production process. That labor is the most expensive, and they want to make sure before they start bringing back people to work or hiring people. So that might actually take late. That's his inflation. You know, in the beginning, you don't have that intense demand. You're not outstripping supply necessarily, but more towards the end. Stock prices, well, that'll often lead an expansion. It's the anticipation. Sometimes we may still be in a recession here, but if people think that an expansion is about to start, you'll see stock prices going up before. Well, that's kind of what we're seeing now, okay? We've got stock prices. We're really in a recession still. technically, I mean, it's been a very unusual turn of events. We've had the economy just kind of shut down as we just stopped. It's like we put on the brakes and, okay, stop because of this coronavirus. But stock prices and the stock market crashed back in March. Oh my goodness, panic. But you know what? After a couple of months, people started to feel a little more comfortable, like, okay, this is bad, but you know what? It's going to get better, and it has. But we're still kind of tender there. Things are flaring up again now. This is disconcerting. But there's a vaccine, maybe on a horizon. Let's hope. Let us hope. Well, anyway, yeah, we're seeing stock prices up there in anticipation of coming out of this thing and roaring right along. Well, okay. That's our little introduction to the economy. And there we go. Again, we will focus on this for the next few chapters, and then at the end we're going to go to short-term fluctuations and focus on that. So that is it for our intro. We'll now pick up with productivity.
Okay, well, there's our little intro, and let me find productivity. Where to go? No, that's not it. Well, okay. Here we are. Okay, whoops. What in the world? Second time it did that.
In this chapter, we're going to talk about, we're going to answer these questions. What causes or allows an economy to grow over time? Why are some countries richer than others? Why do some economies grow faster than others? Well, the answers to all those questions is productivity. That is a huge deal. That is what determines our standard of living. This is really everything in macroeconomics. So what is productivity? How do we define productivity? Productivity is simply how much a worker can produce in an hour. Okay, it could be an hour, it could be a month, it could be a year, whatever. But when we talk about productivity, we're talking per hour. So, why do we have a higher standard of living here in the U.S. than, say, in Uruguay? Because a worker can produce more stuff in an hour than a worker in Uruguay. It's that simple. It's about producing the stuff, okay? We've got to produce it. Before we can redistribute it, we've got to produce it, okay? So we're not talking about redistribution. We're talking the actual wealth must be created. And that's what we're talking about is when we talk about productivity. So what determines productivity? Determinants of productivity. Okay. 1, technology. Technology is simply the current understanding of how best to produce goods and services. Okay, well, how's the best way to cut down trees? For example, there are different technologies to do that. You can use a hatchet. Okay, if you use a hatchet, it's going to take a very long time. You're going to produce very little wood or paper or anything that's associated with wood. You could use an axe. Well, that'll be done a little quicker. Or you could use chainsaws. Okay, quicker still. Different ways to do things, different levels of technology. If you build houses, you can build out of logs, cement, bricks, drywall. There are different ways to build it, different tools to use. When we travel, different levels of technology, right? Just different ways to do things. Transmitting information. Back in the old days, for a while there was the Pony Express. One horse rider would ride like crazy to a station, change horses, ride some more, then change another horse, and then change riders, and they could dash across pretty quick. But, a new technology came along that put all of the Pony Express riders out of business. That's called the telegraph. After the telegraph came along, no more Pony Express. Okay, and then the telephone, and then, of course, the internet, and different levels of technology. The internet, for example, has been just an amazing reformation of the world economy and globalized, really, the world economy. It brought it together in really amazing ways, and a lot of good things from that, a lot of not so great things from that, a lot of a painful adjustment. So technology is always moving things along and creating better and new ways, more productive ways to do things. And as a result, our standard of living, our collective standard of living, just keeps on going up and up and up and up. Travel, different technologies there. You can walk. You can ride a bike. Okay, you can ride a horse. Drive a car, get on an airplane. So there are different technologies. Boy, it used to be, when I fly across the country, I'm just amazed. It's 4 hours, New York to San Francisco, maybe 5. And I'm complaining, okay, 5-hour trip. Then I remember back in the old days, wagon trains took months of hardship, just exhausting days of walking and riding the wagons and fixing wagons and breaking down, and oh my goodness, wow, has that increased productivity? Okay, well, capital. Capital. Well, there are different kinds of capital. Let's start with human capital. Human capital is simply the knowledge and skills workers acquire through education, training, and experience. Okay, that's what you're doing right now. You're acquiring human capital. You're investing in human capital. You're learning stuff. Okay, so human capital is how much of the current state of technology has been transferred to the workforce. You can look at it that way. So you've got this current state of technology. How much of that is actually incorporated in the workforce? There's our level of human capital. let's say the boss of a little bunch of lumberjacks, are out there. Let's say he goes out and buys a whole bunch of a brand new invention called a chainsaw, drops it down, gives, okay, buddy, here's a chainsaw. Everybody has a chainsaw. Go out and cut those trees down. We need a lot of houses built. We need a lot of paper. This will help us do the job. We'll do the job a lot faster, be a lot more productive. Gives a big speech and then walks away. Everybody just sits there staring at it. Well, the chainsaw, this level of technology exists, but if nobody knows how to use the thing, it doesn't do that much good. So you've got to know how to use the chainsaw. Okay, that's human capital. You could say that technology is like the books in the library. You've got all these books in the library, and human capital would be how much people go to the library and read those books. Okay, so the books exist, they're there, but if nobody goes and reads them, well, we don't have the human capital to use the technology. Okay, the third one is physical capital. Okay, so we've got two kinds of capital. I can't talk and write at the same. I can't talk and spell at the same time. Okay, physical capital. So we've got human capital, we've got physical capital. Physical capital are goods that are used in the production of other goods. So goods that are used to produce or in the production of other goods. Okay, a computer, for example. That's physical capital. Computers are used all over the place in businesses, in actual production, and designing the stuff, all kinds of software. Factories, equipment, tools, hammers, screwdrivers, all that is physical capital. And natural resources. Natural resources, forests, lakes, streams, navigable waterways, minerals, okay, oil, all that kind of thing. Places that have a lot of it are better off than those places that do not. So if you are a worker and you have all those things available to you, you have a high level of technology, you have a high level of human capital and physical capital, and natural resources at your disposal, you're going to be a more productive worker, and you are going to have a higher standard of living than a worker who lives somewhere that doesn't have those things available. They're going to have a lower standard of living simply because they're producing less stuff. We define standard of living as, who has more stuff. Well, economies that produce more stuff have more than economies that produce less stuff. And it all hinges on productivity. Now, when we talk about standard of living and so forth, sometimes students will talk about minimum wage or unions. Now, those have had a big impact on the redistribution of wealth, but not on the creation of wealth. Okay, that's why I said at the beginning, we're talking about wealth creation. Unions and laws like minimum wage have been successful, more so at different times than others. Unions don't play as big a part in our economy these days as they once did. And of course, the minimum wage, only if it's above the equilibrium wage does it have any impact. But for better or for worse, we're talking about redistribution of wealth, taken away from one group, given to another group kind of thing. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how it's created, and that's productivity is the name of the game. And so if you want to go to a developing country and solve the poverty problem, this is how you do it. Okay, this is it. We've got to increase their level of productivity. We've got to introduce them, say, to new technologies, to educate the workers. All these things. Well, they may not live in a place where there are natural resources. They might be landlocked in the desert, say in Africa. That makes things a lot tougher. But you can't, if you're going to, for example, yes, to get started, we need to, send some foreign aid. Yes, indeed. But what kind of foreign aid? Well, again, if we're going to produce a solution to the problem, a long-term sustainable solution, this is going to have to be it. This is how you get out of it, is increasing productivity. You've got to increase the productivity of those workers. That's how you get your way, or dig your way, if you will, out of poverty. Now, there's an upside and a downside to productivity. And in the long term, the upside is a higher standard of living. In the short term, there is a downside, and we already alluded to that. New technologies, especially when something comes along that's more productive, it can knock an entire industry out. Talked about the Pony Express workers losing their jobs to the telegraph. The computer, the desktop computer, that put zillions of secretaries out of work, because the computer's now the secretary. You didn't have to write down something to have the secretary type up anymore. You just sat there at the computer, and with word processing software, even mediocre typists could eventually become pretty good typists. I'm certainly one of those. You know what? Back with the old typewriters. Has anyone ever seen one in this class? But yeah, there's this thing called a typewriter ages ago, and you know what? You had to be pretty darn good at typing. You put the paper in and you typed on the thing. I mean, you had to be a skilled typist. And to try to do that, which I did a few times, and you know what? I said, forget it. I spent half my time correcting my mistakes. So I would take my papers to, like when I was in college, I'd take my papers to someone, a professional typist who advertised and typed out school papers. And you know what? Wow. They were very, very talented, very skilled. But you know what? With the word processing, it's easy to correct mistakes and easy to write. You can move paragraphs around with ease, correct spelling mistakes, correct typos, the whole bit. I mean, so even mediocre, with enough practice, this is what happened to me, with enough practice, I began to not just write and then type my own papers on a word processor, which was kind of how you did it in the beginning. You write and type at the same time now, okay? You sit down and write a paper at the keyboard. That's how you actually write. So you're writing and typing in one step. And then you just, edit, move things around, and it's a piece of cake now. But lots and lots of secretaries lost their jobs from that. So are we more productive? Yes. Were newer, better jobs created? Yes. Yes. Now a whole industry of IT and computer developers and repair people. Whole new industries have popped up. The thing is, as things become more productive, more technology, better technology, and productivity increases, yes, it creates jobs, but these jobs are more take more human capital actually to do those jobs. So the jobs that go away require less human capital, and the jobs that replace them require more human capital. And that can be a barrier. And that's why if you learn anything in college, anywhere along the way, the most important skill that you can learn is to learn. Learn how to learn. Because you're going to have to learn things, new things, all throughout your career. You're going to have to read and understand. And you're always going to be in training to learn how to do something new. Learning never stops. Never stops. There's always something new that must be learned. So the most important skill anyone could ever get is to learn how to learn. That's going to keep you on top of things.
Okay, well, oh man, my colleague, Maping Zhang, next door, my economics colleague, is trying to get me a little bit better at this. One of the things, doggone it, I forgot to play with this. Well, I can't find it. Well, I need more training. That was down here. Well, there's a little chat box that I was going to start up, but I don't see it. Well, sorry about that. More training, more on-the-job training. I mean, I'm trying to invest in human capital here, and I'm not doing very well. It's still working on it. Well, the chat box, the little controls disappeared, but anyway, let's finish this off with a little movie about productivity here. Some examples and how productivity's been doing over time. We've had times where it's kind of sluggish, and that concerns us. And anyway, we'll watch this. That'll get us right to the end of the class today. So here we go.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
Throughout most of the 20th century, America enjoyed the highest rate of productivity growth in the industrial world. But by the late 1970s, something was drastically wrong. What was happening to American productivity? By 1981, the nation was ready to try a new approach. Can less government lead to more productivity?
There is general agreement that new technologies increase productivity. But is there an extra return to society that makes the government's investment worthwhile? Productivity is a crucial element of our nation's economic growth. Yet it is an almost invisible element in our economic well-being, something we take for granted until it begins to slow down. But that hasn't happened in the 21st century. To the contrary, American productivity has increased. Productivity. How do we produce more with the same or fewer resources? With the help of economic analysts Richard Gill and Nariman Behravesh, we'll examine that question on this 21st century edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker.
Economists see the world in terms of supply and demand. Put simply, demand is the appetite to consume. Supply is the ability to produce. It is productivity that holds the supply side together. As long as productivity continues to improve, our standard of living continues to improve. This is the classic widget factory. These workers are building a machine to put the stick in a stick deodorant tube. If it works, we'll have more deodorant and less sweat. That is, fewer hours of work putting the tubes together. That's productivity for you. American productivity has been one of the economic marvels of the industrial age. But by the late 1970s, our rate of productivity growth had slumped alarmingly. Why did productivity grow so fast for so long and then suddenly decline in the 1970s? At the beginning of the 19th century, America was predominantly a farm economy. Our buildings were made of brick and wood. By the year 1900, we were a nation of steel. Vast deposits of iron and coal fed the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh. Immigrants poured in from Europe to work in the steel mills, to be part of an industrial miracle that was creating a better life for American workers. Rapid productivity growth led to an ever-improving standard of living. And the miracle was not just confined to the steel industry. Throughout the economy, American workers were the most productive in the world. What was responsible for this phenomenal explosion of productivity? Economist Edward Dennison singles out one factor as paramount.
Much the most important is advances in knowledge of how to produce at low cost. This includes both technological knowledge and what you'd call managerial or organizational knowledge, how to run a business and organize it. And actually, over a long period, like 1929 to 82, actually, this accounts for almost 2/3 of the total increase.
In agriculture, advances in knowledge led to new seeds, machinery, and chemicals, and more crops from fewer workers. Displaced farm workers migrated to the cities, to more productive jobs in the factories and steel mills of industrial America. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, productivity soared. But by the 1970s, something was drastically wrong. Throughout the economy, productivity growth was slowing down. The reasons were not immediately clear, but in retrospect, several factors stand out. The beginning of the 1970s brought a new era of concern about the environment. Regulations aimed at cleaning up pollution had an immediate and costly impact on American industry. Bethlehem Steel President Walter Williams.
We spent, if I remember the number correctly, in the equivalent of $1980, almost $1 billion in the previous 15 years on environmental facilities. Now that meant that that money was not available for modernization projects.
Government regulations forced industry to spend billions cleaning up the environment and protecting the safety of its workers. And millions of these workers were new to the job, baby boomers, eager to work, but still young and untrained. Their inexperience led to lower output per hour of work, less productivity. In 1973, war in the Mideast led to an embargo of oil from the Persian Gulf. Energy prices soared. Productivity growth took a nosedive. And throughout the 1970s, an economy reeling from spiraling energy costs saw all its other costs rising too. Inflation seemed to be an incurable cancer eating away at the American economy, creating a climate of economic fear and uncertainty, discouraging the capital investment that might have improved an increasingly dismal productivity performance. If many different factors had been responsible for the growth of American productivity, it seemed that an equal diversity of factors was conspiring to retard that growth. Productivity performance during the 1970s dropped to less than half the rate of the previous half-century. And productivity expert Edward Dennison was not encouraging about the prospects for an easy cure.
I think the most important thing to recognize is that no one thing is going to make an enormous difference. And I once was given the task of trying to find some quick fix for the growth rate. And my conclusion was it just takes an enormous amount of doing to get even a tenth of a point addition.
Productivity is an elusive concept. You'll find the tale of a kingdom lost for want of a nail in poetry, not in economics. Just as there were many factors that contributed to the phenomenal growth of American productivity, so there were many factors that contributed to the decline in growth in the 1970s, factors that resist quick and easy solutions. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill to comment on the long-range significance of productivity growth and the factors that might cause it to decline.
Many people fail to understand the true significance of productivity growth because the numbers we use to express it, 1 or 2% a year, seem very small. The first thing to realize is that these small numbers involve really huge changes in output per capita and living standards over long periods of time. Our historic rate of productivity increase of between 1.5% and 2% a year has meant a 5-fold increase in our real incomes over the past century. So productivity growth is important, and any decline in it is necessarily a matter for concern. But was the decline we observed in the 1970s a permanent one or merely temporary? There certainly were many special factors at work during the 1970s. The oil shocks made energy inputs suddenly much more expensive. Rapid inflation increased economic uncertainty. The composition of the labor force, with many young and inexperienced new entrants, was changing, and so on. On the other hand, certain factors, for example, government regulations to protect the environment, may be with us for some time to come. Nor do we know that the 1970s bout with high inflation will be our last. Nor, for that matter, what new supply shocks may hit us in the years ahead. Whatever the future, the experience of the 1970s strongly suggested that productivity growth was something we could no longer take for granted. Was there anything we could do to improve it?
We have the highest percentage of outmoded industrial plant and equipment of any of the industrial nations. I stood in Ohio in a great empty shell of a building that was once a steel plant. The weeds are beginning to grow up. Closed because they could not afford to modernize. And punitive taxes and those excessive regulations mandating additional costs on them had been responsible.
Ronald Reagan promised to get the government off the backs of the American people. He argued that less government would give us greater productivity. The keystone of his plan was a $750 billion tax cut. In 1981, the crucial question was, how could we get more productivity with less taxation? The 1970s had been difficult years for America, for the people, for the government, even for economists. By 1980, a growing number of people saw the government as the source, not the solution, of economic miseries. A new group of economists began to say, let's unshackle private enterprise. Let's get the government out of the marketplace. Let's give the people an incentive to produce. These economists were called supply-siders, and their spokesman was Arthur Laffer.
People don't work to pay taxes. People work to get what they can after tax. People don't increase the productivity of their capital or their labor or their production process to give the money away to the government. They do it to make more profits themselves. And when you cut the taxes, you increase their incentives for doing that activity, and you'll increase productivity, output, and employment. I mean, who cares about productivity when you don't get any benefits from it? And frankly, people don't work for nothing. They work to get paid. And when you increase the amount they get after tax, you'll find them doing more of it.
Laffer believed that tax cuts would cause people to work harder. Economist Norman Ture argued that the result would be increased savings.
Every dollar of additional saving represents an additional dollar of capital of some sort. It is a fundamental law of economics, which to my knowledge has not been repealed either by John Maynard Keynes or the United States Congress, that the most effective way of increasing the productivity of labor is by increasing the quantity and the quality of the capital with which it is employed.
We move on to the individual, you and me. And my proposal is for a 10% cut in the income tax across the board, not a special cut for someone while someone else, you know, rob Peter and pay Paul. We're all named Peter today. 10%. A 10% in 1982 and another 10% in 1983. A 30% cut over a 3-year period.
But mainstream economists like Nariman Behrovesh remain sharply critical of Reagan's supply-side tax proposal.
I think the issue was that most people believed that there was some impact of reducing marginal tax rates on work effort and savings, but most analysis suggested that that impact was very small. In fact, so small that it would not have the kind of supply-side effects that was being talked about by people like Art Laffer.
The American people were ready for a change. Ronald Reagan swept the victory in the November election, but his battles had only begun. Democrats in the House of Representatives were determined to block the new president's tax plan. But as Reagan prepared to take his program to Congress, he found some new friends along the way and some new ideas for his tax package. Congressman Barber Conable added a carrot for business in the form of faster depreciation of capital investment.
The basic Reagan idea was to have a simple proposal of 2 parts: rate cuts and cuts for business that would be given in such a way that it would encourage investment and therefore improve productivity. And the ACRS 1053 Jones-Conable bill was the second half of the proposal. I felt it was very necessary, in short, to encourage productivity growth, to encourage savings. I am not a Keynesian. I don't believe that you can handle economic policy solely by taking those steps that will stimulate consumption. I think you've got to give some incentive to savings, too.
For months, Reagan, Conable, and the Republicans hammered away at the Democrats in Congress, trying to pry loose enough votes to pass the tax package. But the opposition held. The Reagan program was going nowhere. The tax bill was amended, then amended again in an effort to attract more votes. Then the president took his case directly to the people.
This is absolutely essential if we're to provide incentives and make capital available for the increased productivity required to provide real permanent jobs for our people.
When the votes were counted, the president had muscled through a great political victory. But was it an economic victory as well? Did the tax cut increase productivity?
Yes, clearly. It not only led to better productivity, it also led to an increase in employment. See, to increase output and employment and production in the system, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is productivity, which means you get more for each worker. And the other one is to increase the number of workers. And what you found happening is both went up. We not only got a lot more employment, we also got a lot more productivity per employee, which is just the perfect combination.
I think by all estimates, it really did not succeed terribly well. Part of it is that it was swamped out, the supply side effects were really swamped out by all the demand effects. In other words, the boost to consumption that occurred and the boost to investment spending. The one supply side effect that did come through was that the 81 tax cut did provide very generous benefits to businesses for investment purposes. And this did boost investment, which in a very traditional sort of Keynesian way led to a higher capital stock, led to increased productivity in the long run.
You can call it anything you want. The question is, it works. Now, those of us in sort of the academic garb who like to get into the footnotes and argue there, sure, you can say, well, was it a demand shift or was it a supply shift? Who cares? Production, output, employment increased enormously. Now, I think it was a supply shift.
1981 was a bad year for the economy. 1982 was even worse. But 1983 was a boom year, a year that saw many of President Reagan's economic predictions come true. To many, it seemed we really had improved productivity by cutting taxes. Workers and businesses alike were working harder and investing more. But to the economics community as a whole, the relationship was by no means that simple. We asked Richard Gill to summarize. How does a tax cut stimulate productivity?
The ways in which lowered taxes can improve productivity are fairly obvious. Higher take-home pay may encourage workers to work harder and more efficiently. Lower taxes may provide businesses with more funds for investment and greater incentives to take the risks of introducing new technologies. The real issue is, how large are these effects? Take the Reagan tax cuts of the early 1980s. The supply-side enthusiasts argued that lower tax rates would lead to much higher productivity, which would lead to a greatly increased GNP, and that this greater GNP would actually result in higher total government tax revenues even at the lower rates. In short, we'd get such spectacular increases in productivity and growth that we wouldn't even have to think about government deficits. The less enthusiastic view was that lower tax rates would indeed lead to big budget deficits, that government borrowing would lead to high interest rates, and that this would result in lower business investment and growth. Obviously, the effects of the Reagan tax cuts are very complicated, and many of these effects are still with us. If we simply compare the 2 years, 1981 and 1984, we can say, yes, productivity did increase. Yes, there was growth. Yes, in fact, total federal tax revenues did increase slightly. But also, yes, there were huge budget deficits, and yes, real interest rates stayed at damagingly high levels. Perhaps on one point, both sides might agree. If you're going in for massive tax cuts to spur productivity growth, it would probably also be at least prudent to do something to keep the government spending side of the equation in check.
The internet, linked to satellites, combined with software, operated by computers and smartphones. The information age is upon us. Transforming technological innovations allow us to be more productive personally and in all varieties of occupations and industries. It appears to be a national addiction.
The idea of like waiting around just doesn't happen as much today. And you know, for businesses, that's just really important. They're just able to be productive all the time.
The benefits of technological innovation are not confined to the innovators or firms that finance the innovation, but to society as a whole.
I wish more people could go back into a time machine and what it was back in the early 90s, back before, you know, the internet and communication technology, where landline phones were still kind of, you know, all the rage. You know, life was much more difficult. Communicating people was a real hassle.
After years of being stalled, productivity growth in the United States was kick-started in 1995 when the technology industry began to boom. Robotics revolutionized the automobile industry. Big box retailers put barcodes and inventory tracking to productive use. Banks made use of electronic banking and ATMs to streamline their business. Telephone and telecom businesses, automating many services, also had huge increases in productivity. The federal government has long recognized the spillover effect of technological innovations. That is, the extra return to society from research and development investments made to develop new products. But research and development can be costly and time-consuming. Is it then appropriate for the federal government to invest in research and development?
If you look then within the non-defense portion of R&D, you see a lot of money is spent by the National Institutes of Health. And a lot of that is for basic biological research. And the thinking there is that if we better understand the human genome, if we better understand how cells work, then the NIH spends a lot of money on those very basic principles, which will then help us propel new medical discoveries. So that's a clear example of where if we think we do this basic research, if if we have a better understanding of how things work, then that will be a good platform for other inventions to occur.
The classic examples of platforms that the government nurtured were satellites and the internet. Government support has resulted in the flowering of thousands of offshoots. Take, for example, weather forecasting.
Some of the early experiments, there's a great story in the numerical weather forecasting process, were done in the 50s, where it took about 2 or 3 days of computer time to generate a 24-hour forecast. So the great increase in computer power has allowed us to ingest much, much more information and data and then generate a forecast information in a very timely manner, and also make it then that much a smaller scale. And also very accurately now, days, 5, 6, even 7 days in advance, something we couldn't do 20, 30 years ago.
Technological innovation has increased the productivity of weather forecasters and has made weather information readily available, increasing our productivity as well.
Now we have also a variety of tools where we can put these onto our homepage, onto our website. So somebody that says, I only want to see the winds. Well, here's a graphic. You can see the winds. You could see what the temperatures would be at 8, 9, 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Never was this ability to make accurate weather predictions more pronounced than in the winters of 1993 and 1996.
Back in the 90s, when a lot of these very accurate local numerical simulations were coming on, I was able to see the potential for this big, big snow event. And I remember communicating and telling people, wherever you are tomorrow, plan on being there for a long time.
This is an example of weather, but more generally what we're talking about is you're able to get information that you need to make the right decisions. It's very easy, it's very cheap to get information. And lots of companies are basically trying to customize this information to you. We're just flooded with information now because of all this information technology. And now I think we're beginning to use that information better, and it makes us more productive.
There is no more often cited example of government's contribution to America's productivity gain than that represented by its investment in space and satellite communication. But would this increase have occurred anyway, without government research and funding? We asked Nariman Behravesh to comment.
Technological innovation has been a major factor in the growth of productivity in the United States. The development of new products and processes allow people to do what they were doing before, using less time, and just as important, to do what they never dreamed of doing before. There is a catch, however, since the benefits of innovation do not accrue only to the person or company that developed the new technology, but are often enjoyed by society as a whole, there can be a disincentive to the developer. Specifically, others can use or exploit the innovation without compensating the innovator. Economists classify this type of technology spillover as a positive externality. Unfortunately, given the disincentives associated with such spillovers, the free market, left to its own devices, will encourage less innovation than is socially desirable. To remedy this problem, the government can internalize the externality in multiple ways: by sponsoring research and development at one of the many government-run labs, by giving subsidies for private sector R&D, and by strengthening patent protection. There are lots of examples of government-sponsored technologies transforming our lives. The NASA Moon program spurred the development of the all-pervasive microchip. The Department of Defense's DARPANET was eventually transformed into the Internet. And the Global Positioning System, GPS, developed for the military, has made it easier for all of us to find our way around. These success stories have led some economists to advocate for an even bigger involvement of the government in innovation. Other economists are more skeptical of this type of industrial policy. They worry that the government is not in the best position to pick technology winners, and that the process can become highly politicized. They advocate instead for greater use of the patent protection system, which gives inventors a temporary monopoly on new technologies.
In the last few decades, American productivity has shot up, whether it came through the necessity of competition, the creation of new technologies, or government-funded research and development. One thing remains clear: increased productivity will always be the lifeblood of the American economy. For this 21st century edition of Economics USA, I'm David Shoemaker.
All right, guys. Been a good day. That was interesting stuff. Tell ya, I don't get tired of it. So nothing's better than productivity. So go out and be productive. Keep investing in that human capital and learn how to do more stuff. And so you can get more stuff. You can be a more productive member of society and have a higher standard of living for yourselves. That's what you're here for. And we will continue on with productivity on Thursday. So we'll see you Thursday again, chapter 23. Wrap that up tonight if you haven't already. Hopefully you've already done it by now. And 24 on Thursday. So see you on Thursday. Have a great day.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Thank you. So talk to
Have a good
you
one.
Thursday. If you have any questions, come contact me by all means.
Have a good one.
Thank you.